Howdy everyone, and today we're examining a full-frame fast standard zoom lens with image stabilization, only the second I've ever tested actually, the Tamron SP 24-70mm f2.8 DI VC USD G2 version. It replaces its 5-year-old predecessor, which I tested out a while ago now. This new G2 version of the lens enjoys a number of improvements over the older version, not least that it actually looks a lot cooler on the outside, although apparently there aren't really any changes in its optics. We'll see about its image quality in a minute. On a full-frame camera, that 24-70mm zoom range is immensely popular for a reason. It's useful. You get a very wide angle in there, zooming into a short telephoto 70mm. Admittedly, it's not a huge zoom range, but if you want that bright maximum aperture of f2.8, then this is the only common option on the market really. Any more zoom range than that for a full-frame f2.8 lens, and the design will have to be very big and optically compromised, as Tamron themselves learned back in the 90s. If you're using an APS-C camera, then that zoom range will be the full-frame equivalent of about 36 to 105mm, with a depth of field that will look deeper. Again, a useful zoom range, although not a very wide angle to start from. A dedicated 17 to 50mm lens for APS-C cameras will be much smaller and less expensive too. Alright, let's see about this Tamron lens's build quality. The lens itself is pretty large, and it's heavier than its more plasticky predecessor, weighing about 900 grams or 2 pounds. It's much tougher though. The design is really tight and solid. It definitely has a professional feel. It's based on a metallic lens mount, as you'd expect, with a weather sealing gasket around the edge. The focus ring is rubberized and turns quite smoothly and precisely. You can turn it at any time. The zoom ring turns a lot more smoothly than on the older version of the lens, which was just plain stiff. It doesn't quite turn as smoothly as Sigma's latest art lenses though. You won't need that zoom lock switch for a long time. There's no zoom creep in the mechanism. For all you video makers out there, this lens is pretty much parfocal. I tested it, so the focus doesn't change when you zoom in and out. However, the lens does suffer from some considerable focus breathing. The image will zoom in and out a bit as you change focus. Now, let's look at the autofocus system. Very quick and quiet, and decently accurate in my tests. If you're recording video, then your camera's internal microphone will pick up a little sound though. As I mentioned before, this lens is image stabilized. Here's some footage with stabilization turned off and now turned on. It's one of the most solid and firm systems I've ever seen. That image is rock steady, which will be enormously helpful for stills or video work. It works silently too. But some video makers should be aware that the image stabilization system jerks around a little as you tilt and pan the lens. The lens comes with a free hood which clicks and locks in place, and its filter size is a large 82mm wide. Overall, the build quality is just fantastic, really professional, a nice improvement over its more plasticky predecessor. Let's see about image quality then. I'll test it on 3 different types of cameras, so skip ahead to the one that's most relevant for you. Firstly, a lower resolution full-frame camera, a 20MP Canon 6D. At a widest angle of 24mm and a widest aperture of f2.8, image quality is bitingly sharp in the middle with good contrast. The corners are a little softer, with some slight chromatic aberration. Stop down to f4 for a punchier image, and f5.6 is very sharp. It stays this sharp down to f11, and even f16 is still good. Let's zoom in about halfway to 45mm. At f2.8, image quality remains very sharp in the middle. The corners at f2.8 are a bit softer than they were at 24mm. However, simply stop down to f4 for a dramatic improvement. Again, it stays about this sharp down to f11 or so. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 70mm. At f2.8, the lens is slightly softer in the middle of the image now, although not bad by any means. The corners are looking quite weak though, but again, stop down to only f4 for a very dramatic improvement there and excellent sharpness back in the middle of the image. f5.6 is even slightly better in the middle and the corners are excellent now. The corners stayed this sharp down to f11. So overall, on a 20 megapixel full frame camera, this lens does quite well. The image quality at 70mm and f2.8 is a bit disappointing, but at all focal lengths, the lens only needs to be stopped down to f4 for an excellent performance. Let's challenge the lens with a 42 megapixel full frame camera now, my Sony a7R II. At 24mm and f2.8, the middle of the image looks spectacular. The corners do not, unfortunately. f4 is a little better there, but f5.6 and f8 are dramatically better. Some colour fringing is still visible though. Let's zoom in halfway to 45mm. At f2.8 again, the image quality is razor sharp in the middle of the image. The corners are soft though. They improve at f4 and f5.6 and f8, they are fairly sharp. Let's zoom all the way into 70mm now. At f2.8, the image quality is only quite sharp with slightly reduced contrast. The corner image quality is poor. f4 is only slightly better, but the image in the middle is sharper. f5.6 is fantastically sharp in the middle, and over in the corners we also see a vast improvement. f8 is very sharp in the corners. So the 42 megapixel Sony sensor is quite a challenge for this lens. Central sharpness is always nicely possible, but for best results in the corners, stop down to f5.6. Finally, let's try a 24 megapixel APS-C camera and see what happens. Straight from f2.8, image quality is brilliant in the middle and very good in the corners. Stop down to f4 and the corner image quality becomes very impressive, albeit with a touch of chromatic aberration. It stays this sharp down to about f8. Stop down any darker than that and you'll start to see softness from the effects of diffraction. Let's zoom in to 45mm. At f2.8, the middle still looks really impressive, but the corner image quality is a little weak. Stop down to f4 though for, you guessed it, a huge improvement. Again, it stays this sharp down to f8. And finally, let's zoom all the way into 70mm. As you might expect from the full frame test results, at f2.8, image quality in the middle is noticeably soft, and the corners are also weak. Stop down to f4 for an improvement in the corners and in the middle, and at f5.6 those corners are really sharp, and at f8 they're just as good. So, at wider angles, the Tamron lens is actually very impressive on a challenging 24 megapixel APS-C sensor, but at 70mm you'll definitely want to stop down to about f5.6 for best results. Let's see about distortion and vignetting on a full frame camera. At 24mm there's some pretty strong barrel distortion, as you might expect for this type of lens. At f2.8 there's some pretty sudden vignetting in the corners. Stop down to f4 for an improvement, and at f5.6 the sharpest vignetting is pretty much gone. Zoom in to 35mm and that distortion straightens out. The vignetting also is not so bad in the middle of the zoom range. Zoom in further down to 70mm and there's moderate pincushion distortion and again stronger than average vignetting. Again though, it's reduced at f4 and gone by f5.6. So it's a fairly average performance for vignetting and distortion for a lens of its type. The lens can focus down to about 36cm, close enough for a lens in this class, and even at f2.8 the close-up image quality is pretty sharp. Let's see how well the lens works against bright light. There's quite a bit of flaring, as you can see, but contrast levels remain pretty high, so swings and roundabouts here. Finally, bokeh. With the older, original lens, I found that its bokeh was actually a bit nasty, pretty busy looking, something I've noticed on one or two other Tamron zoom lenses. However, I'm pleased to say that this new G2 version of the lens is completely different. I don't know what Tamron did, but this new lens's bokeh is really smooth in almost every situation. Nice. One thing to note though is that very bright points of light display a little concentric circling. So overall, the Tamron 24-70mm f2.8 VC USD G2 is certainly not a perfect lens, but there's also plenty to really like about it. It could be sharper in its corners at wide apertures, and a sharpness at 70mm overall is not impressive. However, center sharpness is very good, and the whole image gets really sharp when you stop down a little, so it is capable of excellence. And bearing in mind its awesome build quality, excellent image stabilization and lovely smooth bokeh, it's actually a very enjoyable lens to use, and those particular attributes make this G2 version of the lens just about worth the price difference over the original model, in my opinion. The most demanding professional photographers will want a little more sharpness, but I think everyone else will be delighted, so this lens easily comes recommended.